This property is no longer yours. You have 10 minutes to collect your people and leave. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and foul like exhaust. Arthur Finch stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his thin lips. Behind him, the familiar dark oak of the front door was marred by a glint of new brass, a lock Samuel Vance did not have a key for. The afternoon sun, usually a welcome warmth on his face, felt accusatory. Neighbors peered from behind curtains. A few stood on their porches, phones held low, uncertain. Samuel Vance stood on the walkway, his wife Eleanor's hand resting lightly on his forearm. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched the man who had just rendered him homeless. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the collective breath-holding of the block. Finch rocked back on his heels, enjoying the performance. He thought he was evicting a tenant. He was about to learn he was challenging a man who understood the rules of engagement better than he ever would. Before continuing, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. 3 days earlier, the world had been ordered and calm. It began, as most days did for Samuel, before the sun. 5:15 a.m. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed a soft red. He rose without a sound, a habit ingrained from 25 years in the Army. He moved through the quiet house, his feet sure on the worn floorboards he and Eleanor had chosen together a decade ago. This house wasn't just a rental. It was the repository of their life post service, the place their daughter Maya still called home when she came back from college. In the kitchen, the air was cool and smelled faintly of the rosemary bush outside the window. The ritual was always the same. Grind the beans, fill the coffee maker, and while it hissed and dripped, stand on the back porch. He watched the sky bleed from deep indigo to a soft, promising gray over the silhouette of Mrs. Gable's ancient oak tree next door. He took 3 deep breaths, counting each one. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8, a technique for controlling the heart rate, for finding the center in chaos. In the quiet of the morning, it was just a way to greet the day. He had learned a long time ago that discipline wasn't just for the battlefield, it was for life. It was the structure upon which a man could build a foundation of peace. Eleanor found him there, as she always did, a cup in her hand. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood like that for a full 5 minutes, watching the light change, the silence between them more comforting than any conversation. Her presence was his anchor. In a life that had demanded so much of his focus and resolve, she was the quiet harbor he always returned to. The coffee was ready. They drank it at the small kitchen table, sunlight finally streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was teaching the Civil War that week, a subject that always felt deeply personal, a reminder of the nation's fragile, often broken promises. Eleanor was preparing for the library summer reading program. Their lives were a tapestry of quiet service, of community, of order. The first sign of disruption was small, almost dismissible. A letter taped to their front door 2 days ago. Not mailed, not placed in the mailbox, but taped, like a notice of condemnation. It was from Finch. The language was stilted, overly formal, and vaguely threatening. It mentioned an inspection for lease compliance and cited a clause in their rental agreement that Samuel knew, from his meticulous reading, did not exist in that form. It was a power play, another in a series of minor aggressions they had weathered over the past year. A broken dishwasher that took a month to fix. A lost rent check that miraculously appeared after Samuel produced a bank statement. Passive-aggressive comments about the state of their garden, which was, by all accounts, the most beautiful on the block. Samuel had responded as he always did, with calm, documented precision. He emailed Finch a polite but firm reply, quoting the actual lease agreement, section and paragraph, and attached a PDF of the signed document for his convenience. He reminded Mr. Finch that 24 hours written notice was required for any non-emergency entry, and that they would be happy to schedule a time that was mutually agreeable. He received no reply. That wasn't unusual. Finch preferred confrontation over communication. He was a man who seemed to draw energy from conflict, whose authority felt real to him only when it was being imposed on someone else. Samuel recognized the type. He'd seen them in uniform, men who confused rank with respect, who mistook shouting for leadership. They were always the most brittle when challenged. The quiet of their ordered life held for another day. Samuel taught his classes, engaging his students in a debate about the meaning of justice versus the rule of law. Eleanor helped a young girl find her first chapter book at the library. They had dinner, talked about Maya's upcoming exams, and watched the news. They fell asleep to the familiar hum of the house. They had no idea it was the last night they would spend in it. The next afternoon, they returned from a trip to the grocery store to find the new lock. To find Arthur Finch standing there, a sentry at the gate of their stolen life, his posture a declaration of war. He had a piece of paper in his hand, a crudely printed notice to vacate. It wasn't a court order. It was just words on a page, given weight only by the man's audacity and the new brass lock. Samuel felt Eleanor's hand tighten on his arm. He could feel the tremor of her anger, her disbelief. He placed his other hand over hers, a silent message. Not yet. We will be disciplined. We will be calm. Finch took a step forward, puffing out his chest. His behavioral signature was on full display. The performative authority, the casual contempt. The notice was posted. You're in violation. I've already begun eviction proceedings. It was a lie, and they both knew it. An eviction is a legal process, a slow-moving gear in the machine of the courts. It requires judges and filings and summons. It does not happen with a screwdriver and a trip to the hardware store. That wasn't law. That was a street fight. And what Finch didn't know was that Samuel Vance, retired colonel, history teacher, husband, and father, had been trained his entire adult life for a fight. He just preferred to wage it on a different kind of battlefield. Mr. Finch, Samuel said, his voice even, calm. It was the voice he'd used to brief generals, the voice he'd used to de-escalate standoffs. You are aware that what you have done is an illegal lockout. Under state law, you cannot change the locks without a court-ordered writ of possession. Finch scoffed, waving the useless paper in his hand. Save your lawyer talk. I know my rights as a property owner. This is my house. That was the first thing Samuel noticed, the possessiveness. My house, not the house I own, not the property. My house? It revealed the core of the man's thinking. He didn't see them as tenants with rights. He saw them as temporary occupants in his space, their presence tolerated only as long as it served him. The inability to see the protagonist as human. Across the street, a teenager named Leo lowered the basketball he'd been bouncing. He lifted his phone, the screen catching the afternoon light. He started recording. The witness had arrived. Next door, Mrs. Gable's screen door creaked open. She stood there, a silent, powerful presence, her face a mask of weary anger. She had seen this before. The elder was watching. The pieces were moving onto the board. Samuel felt a shift in the air. This was no longer just about a lock on a door. It was about a line being drawn in their quiet, orderly neighborhood. Finch saw Samuel's gaze flicker to the neighbors. He liked an audience. It fed him. You want to make a scene? He said, his voice rising. Go ahead. I'll just call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, a threat. It was a classic move of the institutional bully. Invoke a higher, more powerful authority that you believe is on your side. He was confident the system would protect him. The system always had. Samuel Vance said nothing. He simply met the man's gaze. He let the silence stretch. The silence that followed lasted about 7 seconds. In that silence, Samuel made a decision. He would not be reactive. He would be strategic. He would let Finch make all the mistakes. And Finch was making them, one by one. The call for backup was unnecessary. The public confrontation was a tactical error. The illegal eviction itself was a fatal flaw. Samuel gave his wife's hand a final, reassuring squeeze. The time for quiet resolve had begun. The methodical counterattack was about to be planned. He had 21 days of accumulated sick leave from the school district. He now knew how he would be spending them. The wail of a siren split the afternoon quiet a few minutes later, its arrival unnecessarily fast for a landlord-tenant dispute. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb, its lights painting streaks of red and blue across the manicured lawns. Deputy Miller stepped out of the car. He was young, with a military-style haircut that was too severe for his soft features. He moved with a practiced swagger, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm before he'd even assessed the situation. The behavioral signature, hand on holster before speaking. Arthur Finch's entire demeanor changed. The smirking bravado softened into the posture of a victim seeking aid. He strode over to the deputy, his voice now laced with a performative tremor of concern. "Thank you for coming, deputy. This man and his wife are refusing to leave the property. They've been served notice. I'm worried they're going to cause trouble." Miller nodded, not looking at Samuel and Eleanor. He was looking at Finch, accepting his narrative without question. The institutional protection was clicking into place. Miller approached Samuel, his eyes finally landing on him, dismissive and impatient. "Sir, you've been asked to leave. You need to vacate the premises now." Samuel stood his ground, calm and unmoving. "Deputy, my name is Samuel Vance. This is my wife, Eleanor. We are the legal tenants of this residence. We have a signed lease, and our rent is paid in full. Mr. Finch has performed an illegal lockout. That is a crime." He spoke the facts plainly, without emotion. He offered no argument, only a statement of legal reality. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slowly, deliberately, produced a folded document. "This is a copy of our lease agreement. And this," he added, pulling out his phone and swiping to a banking app, "is proof of our electronic rent payment, deposited into Mr. Finch's account 2 days ago." Miller glanced at the papers in Samuel's hand, but made no move to take them. He waved a dismissive hand. "Dismisses documentation without reading it. That's a civil matter, sir. You'll have to take that up with the court. Right now, the property owner wants you gone. If you don't leave, I'll have to arrest you for trespassing." The machine was working exactly as it was designed to. The word of the property owner, a white man, was taken as fact. The documentation of the tenant, a black man, was dismissed as a civil matter. The threat of state-sanctioned violence, arrest, was the enforcement mechanism. Samuel felt a cold, familiar anger rise in his chest. It was an old feeling, one he had learned to manage and channel decades ago. He felt it the way a sailor feels a change in the wind, a deep and powerful current that could either capsize you or, if navigated correctly, carry you forward. He let himself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. Then he put it away. "Deputy," Samuel said, his voice still level, "are you refusing to look at my legal documentation?" This was a precise legal question. It shifted the dynamic. It wasn't about arguing. It was about establishing a record. Miller's jaw tightened. The question was an unexpected move in the script he was used to following. He was being asked to officially state his position, a position he likely knew was legally dubious. "I'm not refusing anything," he snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "I'm telling you this is his property, and he wants you off it. It's simple." It was simple, and it was final. Samuel nodded slowly. He understood. He turned to Eleanor. Her face was a portrait of restrained fury, her dignity a shield against the humiliation being heaped upon them. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "let's call Mrs. Gable." He knew the elderly woman had been watching from her window. He knew she would help. He was not just fighting for a house. He was activating a community. They walked away from their home, the home that held their memories, their books, their lives. They walked past the smirking landlord and the belligerent deputy. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Samuel made a point to look directly at Leo across the street. The boy was still filming. Samuel gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The witness understood. The evidence was being secured. Mrs. Gable's door was already open before they reached her walkway. She ushered them inside, her home smelling of cinnamon and old books. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't need anyone to tell her what had happened. She lived on this block for 50 years and had watched men like Arthur Finch operate with impunity for most of them. She set a kettle on the stove. "You'll stay here," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The guest room is ready. The family anchor. The elder. The witness. Samuel looked around Mrs. Gable's cozy living room, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren, and felt the first tendrils of a strategic plan forming in his mind. He and Eleanor were not homeless. They were guests in the home of an ally. They were not powerless. They had evidence. They had community. Later that evening, sitting at Mrs. Gable's kitchen table, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "What do we do, Sam?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "We do what we've always done," he said. "We follow procedure. We document everything. And we use the system against itself." He pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the first page, he wrote the date and time. Below it, he began to list every detail of the encounter. Deputy Miller's name and badge number, the exact words Finch had used, the time of the 911 call, the presence of witnesses. He was building a case file, just as he'd been taught to do as a young officer. The enemy had made his move, rashly and with arrogance. Now it was Samuel's turn to plan the counterattack. It would not be loud. It would not be explosive. It would be methodical, precise, and devastating. The first call he would make in the morning would be to the Legal Aid Society. He needed a professional ally, someone who knew the local terrain of the courts. The countdown had begun. They had been on the street for 4 hours. The injustice was deepening, and so was his resolve. The next morning, the sun rose with the same indifferent beauty as the day before, but for Samuel and Eleanor, the world was tilted on its axis. Waking up in Mrs. Gable's guest room, surrounded by the scent of lavender and cedar, was a disorienting blend of comfort and crisis. The quiet domesticity of their neighbor's home stood in stark contrast to the violence that had been done to their own lives. Samuel was up at 5:15 a.m., his internal clock indifferent to his circumstances. He bypassed his usual ritual on the porch, instead of standing at the guest room window, watching the light touch the roof of his own home across the lawn. It looked serene, peaceful, as if nothing was wrong. The kind of quiet that was a lie. He let himself feel the anger for exactly 5 minutes. The humiliation of being ordered off his own porch. The fury at a system that saw his skin before it saw his rights. The deep, protective rage he felt on behalf of Eleanor, who had borne the indignity with such grace. He let the feelings wash over him, acknowledged them, and then compartmentalized them. Emotion was fuel, not the engine. The engine had to be strategy. At 8:01 a.m., he made the call. The voice that answered at the Legal Aid Society of Wake County was crisp and professional. He explained his situation in clear, concise terms, using the notes he had prepared. He was an Army veteran. He was a teacher. He had been illegally evicted by his landlord, Arthur Finch. The sheriff's department had refused to intervene on his behalf. He was transferred to the housing unit. A new voice came on the line. "This is Imani Hayes. I'm an attorney here. Can you tell me what happened, Mr. Vance?" Samuel repeated his story, this time with more detail. He relayed the dialogue verbatim. He described Deputy Miller's refusal to view his documents. He mentioned the witness across the street with the video. He spoke for 10 minutes without interruption. When he was finished, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Vance," Imani Hayes said, her voice resonating with a restrained intensity that he immediately recognized and trusted. "Mr. Finch has not only violated the state's Landlord-Tenant Act, he has committed a Class 1 misdemeanor. Deputy Miller, by refusing to act and threatening you with arrest, has failed in his duty to enforce the law. What you have is not just a housing case, it's a civil rights case." The professional ally had been found. She was competent, direct, and driven by genuine conviction. Imani explained the process. She would file for an emergency hearing to restore possession of the property. This would happen quickly, likely within 48 to 72 hours. She would also file a temporary restraining order against Finch to prevent him from entering the property or harassing them further. "I need everything you have, Mr. Vance. Your lease, your rent receipts, your email correspondence with Finch, and I need that video." An hour later, Samuel and Eleanor were sitting in a small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of paper and ambition. Imani Hayes was younger than he'd expected, a sharp, intelligent woman in her early 30s whose eyes missed nothing. She listened intently as they recounted the story again, her pen flying across a legal pad. She didn't offer sympathy, she offered a plan. That was exactly what Samuel wanted. While Imani worked the phones, laying the groundwork for the legal assault, Samuel and Eleanor returned to Mrs. Gable's. The feeling of helplessness began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose. But the system was already moving to protect its own. Just after noon, a different sheriff's deputy, this one older and more stoic, arrived at Mrs. Gable's door. He served Samuel with a temporary restraining order, filed by Arthur Finch. It was a preemptive strike, a classic tactic. Finch was painting Samuel as the aggressor, claiming he had been threatened. The order barred Samuel from coming within 500 feet of his own home. It was a perversion of justice, using a tool meant for protection as a weapon of harassment. The false report had been filed. The machine was grinding on. "He's trying to build a record against you before the hearing," Imani explained over the phone, her voice tight with anger. "It's designed to exhaust you, to make you feel like the criminal. Don't let it. It's a desperate move, and it will backfire." That afternoon, Leo, the teenager from across the street, came over. He was a lanky, quiet kid, a former student of Samuel's from his world history class. He wordlessly handed his phone to Samuel. "I got it all, Mr. Vance." From the moment he started yelling, the video was damning. The quality was clear, the audio crisp. It captured Finch's smug pronouncements, Samuel's calm assertions of his rights, and Deputy Miller's aggressive dismissal of the evidence. It was objective truth in a situation built on lies. "Leo," Samuel said, looking the young man in the eye, "you understand that this is important. They may try to talk to you, to intimidate you." The boy nodded, his expression serious. "I know, sir. You taught us about primary sources. This is one." The witness had delivered the first critical piece of evidence. That evening, as Eleanor and Samuel sat with Mrs. Gable, the older woman went to a closet in her hallway and pulled out a sturdy cardboard box. It was filled with notebooks, dated and labeled in a neat, cursive hand. "Arthur Finch's father owned this whole block at one time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And Arthur is just a meaner copy of his dad. I started keeping track of things after he tried to evict the Hernandez family with a lie about them having a dog. That was 15 years ago." She opened one of the notebooks. Inside were meticulously recorded accounts of Finch's dealings with tenants. Illegal rent hikes, ignored repair requests, threats, and at least 2 other instances of illegal lockouts where the families, exhausted and without resources, had simply given up and left. She had dates, names, and in some cases, notarized statements from the former tenants she had kept in touch with. The box of evidence. The elder had been keeping records for years, waiting for a moment, for a person, who would know what to do with them. Samuel felt a profound sense of gravity as he looked at the box. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for every family Finch had bullied, for every person who had been ground down by the machine until they gave up. The hearing was set for the day after tomorrow, 48 hours. The countdown was on. The stakes were no longer just about their home. They were about dismantling a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to fester in their community for decades. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stood at the window again, looking at the dark shape of his house. He thought about the history he taught, about the long, slow, often brutal struggle for justice in a country that promised it to all but delivered it to a select few. He had learned a long time ago that the arc of the moral universe was long, but it didn't bend on its own. People had to pull on it. Hard. With documented evidence, with unshakable resolve, and with the strength of a community that refused to look away. He felt Eleanor come up behind him, her hand on his back. A quiet, private exchange that the world was not privy to, but that gave him all the strength he needed. "We're going to win this, Sam," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just covered her hand with his own and stared out at the house, a silent promise to every person who had been wronged. The counterattack was now fully armed. The day before the hearing was a blur of methodical preparation. Imani Hayes' small office became their war room. The air hummed with the quiet intensity of a command center before a major operation. Copies were being made, affidavits were being drafted, and a clear linear narrative of abuse was being constructed from the disparate pieces of evidence. The video from Leo, the decades of documentation from Mrs. Gable, and the Vance's own meticulous records formed a powerful trifecta. Samuel watched Imani work, impressed by her strategic intelligence. She wasn't just building a case to get them back in their home. She was building a case to expose a pattern of predatory behavior that was legally actionable on multiple fronts, civil and potentially criminal. She arranged Mrs. Gable's notebooks not just as character evidence against Finch, but as proof of violations of the Fair Housing Act, suggesting a pattern of targeting specific types of tenants. She transcribed the audio from Leo's video, highlighting Deputy Miller's refusal to perform his duties, laying the groundwork for a formal complaint to the Office of Professional Responsibility. "They will expect you to be emotional," Imani advised Samuel as they prepped him for his testimony. "They will expect you to be angry. The judge will see a black man who has been wronged, and their biases, conscious or not, will be looking for confirmation of a stereotype. Your composure is your most powerful weapon. State the facts. Do not offer opinions. Let the evidence speak." Samuel nodded. He understood this language. It was the language of discipline, of emotional control in the face of provocation. It was the core of his being. He had spent a career being underestimated, of having to be twice as good, twice as calm, twice as prepared. This was familiar territory. That afternoon, the turning point arrived, not with a bang, but with a quiet, hesitant phone call. The call was for Samuel, routed through Imani's office. The caller ID was blocked. "Mr. Vance, you don't know me," a young woman's voice said, nervous but determined. "My name is Maria. I was in your AP history class 5 years ago. You gave me a B- on my paper about eminent domain, and you told me I needed to back up my arguments with better evidence." Samuel remembered her, a bright, quiet student. "I remember, Maria. I hope you're well." "I am. I work at the county records office now," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I saw the filing for the restraining order from Arthur Finch. The property address, it seemed familiar. I've been seeing it pop up a lot lately." The insider had come forward. Maria explained that a developer named Silas Thorne had been quietly buying up properties on their block and the surrounding 3 blocks. The purchases were being made through a series of shell LLCs, but the paperwork, if you knew where to look, all traced back to Thorne. Their house was one of only a handful on the block that hadn't been sold. "Here's the thing, Mr. Vance," Maria continued, her voice gaining confidence. "I saw a preliminary plat application filed by Thorne's company for a massive new condo development. It was filed 2 months ago. The application assumes ownership of your lot. It's already drawn into the plans." The silence on the phone was heavy with implication. This wasn't just a landlord being a bully. This was a coordinated effort to force them out. Finch wasn't just trying to get rid of a tenant. He was clearing the way for a multi-million-dollar development deal. His illegal eviction was a tactic in a much larger, more lucrative war. "Maria," Samuel said, his voice steady, "can you get me a copy of that application?" "It's a public record," she replied. "I'll email the file number to your lawyer. You taught me to always cite my sources." After the call, the entire case was recontextualized. Finch's aggression, his impatience, his willingness to break the law, it all made sense now. He wasn't just being malicious, he was on a deadline. Silas Thorne was a powerful local figure, a man with deep connections in city politics. This explained why Deputy Miller might have been so quick to side with Finch. Pressure could have been applied from above. The machine wasn't just a metaphor, it was a real network of money and power designed to protect its own. Imani's eyes gleamed with a cold fire. "This is it," she said, pulling up the county property database on her laptop. "This is what we use to break them." The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer on the defensive, pleading for the return of their home. They were on the offensive, armed with evidence of a conspiracy. The case was no longer just about Samuel and Eleanor Vance versus Arthur Finch. It was about a community versus a predatory developer and the corrupt systems that enabled him. The protection that Finch and Miller had counted on was about to become their greatest liability. Their connection to Silas Thorne, which they thought was their strength, was now their fatal weakness. That evening, there was a different kind of quiet at Mrs. Gable's house. It wasn't the quiet of anxiety, but the quiet before the storm. Eleanor made a simple dinner of soup and bread. They ate at the kitchen table, the box of evidence sitting on a nearby chair like a silent guest. Samuel felt the pieces of his life, which had been scattered by the chaos of the last 48 hours, begin to click back into place, forming a new, harder, and more resolute picture. He thought of the lesson he taught his students about the Battle of Gettysburg, how the Union Army held the high ground, forcing the Confederates to attack a fortified position, leading to their own destruction. Finch and Thorne had been so confident in their power that they had charged recklessly uphill. Samuel, Imani, and their small band of allies now held the high ground. They had the evidence, they had the law on their side, and they had the truth. The hearing tomorrow wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, and Samuel Vance was ready. He had spent his life preparing for moments like this when a stand had to be made, not with force, but with the unyielding power of a righteous and well-documented case. The courtroom was small and suffocating, paneled in cheap wood veneer and lit by the sickly yellow-white of fluorescent tubes. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and faint desperation. Arthur Finch sat at the respondent's table with his lawyer, a slick, overconfident man who kept whispering in Finch's ear, prompting small, smug smiles. They looked relaxed, as if this were a mere formality. Deputy Miller was there, too. not as a party to the case, but sitting in the back row, a visible show of institutional solidarity. He was there to intimidate, to remind the room of the power Finch had on his side. He caught Samuel's eye and gave a slight, contemptuous smirk. Samuel and Eleanor sat beside Imani Hayes at the petitioner's table. Samuel wore the same suit he wore to teach, a simple, well-kept gray wool. He sat perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting on the table. He looked not like a victim, but like a man patiently waiting for a meeting to be called to order. Eleanor sat beside him, her presence a quiet testament to their shared strength. The judge, a woman in her late 60s named Judge Carol Wallace, entered the room. She had a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who despised procedural sloppiness and had little patience for theatrics. This was a fact Imani had counted on. Finch's lawyer went first, painting a picture of Samuel as an aggressive, disgruntled tenant who had threatened his client. He presented the restraining order as proof. Mr. Finch was in fear for his safety, Your Honor. He was merely taking steps to secure his property. Then it was Imani's turn. She stood, her voice calm and clear, a stark contrast to the blustering tone of the opposing counsel. Your Honor, we are here today because my client, Mr. Samuel Vance, and his wife Eleanor were illegally evicted from their home. We are not here to discuss Mr. Finch's baseless fears. We are here to discuss his criminal actions. She began methodically, clinically. She submitted their signed lease. She submitted 12 consecutive months of cashed rent checks and bank statements. She established, beyond any doubt, that the Vances were tenants in good standing. Then she called Samuel to the stand. He walked to the witness box with a steady, measured pace. He recounted the events of the lockout, his voice even and devoid of emotion. He spoke of Deputy Miller's arrival, of his refusal to look at the lease. Finch's lawyer tried to rattle him on cross-examination. Isn't it true, Mr. Vance, that you became belligerent, that you raised your voice? No, sir, Samuel replied, his eyes on the judge. I did not. I stated my legal rights. So you're saying Deputy Miller is lying? I am saying that his assessment of the situation was not consistent with the facts. Next, Imani called her surprise witness. The petitioner calls Leo Martinez. Leo walked to the stand, nervous but resolute. Imani asked him one simple question. Leo, did you witness the events on the afternoon of May 14th? Yes, ma'am. And did you by chance record those events? A ripple went through the courtroom. Finch's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. Ambush. We were not made aware of any video evidence. It's rebuttal evidence, Your Honor, Imani said smoothly, rebutting the claim that my client was the aggressor. Judge Wallace leaned forward, her interest piqued. I'll allow it. The video played on a large monitor set up for the court. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the clear audio and steady picture. It showed Finch's arrogance. It showed Samuel's unshakable composure. And most damningly, it showed Deputy Miller's dismissive wave of the hand, his outright refusal to look at Samuel's documents, and his threat of arrest. The smirk was wiped clean from Miller's face in the back of the room. Finch stared at the screen, his face turning a blotchy red. Imani wasn't done. She introduced Mrs. Gable's box of evidence. Your Honor, this is not the first time Mr. Finch has used these tactics. She presented the sworn affidavits from 2 other families who had been illegally locked out by Finch over the past decade. The judge's expression hardened. The case was no longer about a simple dispute. It was about a clear and disturbing pattern. Finally, Imani delivered the finishing blow. She presented the preliminary plat application filed by Silas Thorne's development company. She showed the court how the plans for the new condominium complex already included the Vance's property. Mr. Finch's actions were not born of fear, Your Honor. They were born of greed. He wasn't securing his property. He was clearing it for a developer. This wasn't a landlord-tenant dispute. It was a conspiracy to illegally deprive my clients of their home to make way for a multi-million-dollar real estate deal. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Finch's lawyer was speechless. The narrative had been completely and irrevocably shattered. Judge Wallace looked down from the bench, her eyes cold with fury. She looked at Finch, then at his lawyer. Is there anything you would like to say in response to this? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Finch's lawyer stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Judge Wallace had heard enough. Her ruling was swift and brutal. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, Possession of the property at 121 Oak Street is hereby restored to you, effective immediately. Mr. Finch is ordered to pay for the cost of a locksmith to rekey the residence for you today." She then turned her attention to Finch directly. "Mr. Finch, your actions are not just an affront to the law. They are an affront to human decency. The evidence of a pattern of harassment and illegal eviction is overwhelming. I am fining you the maximum amount allowable under the statute for an illegal eviction, which is 3 times the monthly rent, plus attorney's fees. Furthermore, I am granting Mr. Vance a permanent restraining order against you." But she didn't stop there. "Given the evidence of perjury in your petition for a restraining order and the evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud, I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation." She then looked toward the back of the courtroom, her eyes locking on Deputy Miller. "And I will be filing a formal complaint with the Sheriff's Department and the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Board regarding the conduct of Deputy Miller. His failure to uphold the law in this matter is a disgrace to his badge." The reckoning was complete. It was public. It was total. As the court adjourned, 2 bailiffs approached the respondent's table. They spoke quietly to Arthur Finch, then instructed him to stand and place his hands behind his back. He was being arrested for perjury. The irony was devastating. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the same restraints he had threatened Samuel with, his face a mask of disbelief. The system he had relied on, the machine he thought would protect him, had turned and devoured him. Samuel and Eleanor watched him go, not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber sense of justice delivered. The battle was over. The long fight for systemic change, however, was just beginning. The return to their home was surreal. A locksmith, his services paid for by a cashier's check delivered from Finch's lawyer's office, worked on the front door. The new brass lock, the symbol of their dispossession, was removed and replaced with a new, more secure one. Samuel held the new set of keys in his palm. They felt heavier than the old ones, weighted with the struggle they represented. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The house was just as they had left it. A carton of milk on the kitchen counter, a book left open on the living room coffee table. It was a snapshot of a life interrupted. The air inside was stuffy, but it was their air. It was their home. Eleanor walked through the rooms first, touching the furniture, running her hand along the spines of the books on their shelves. It was a quiet reclamation, a silent assertion of their right to be there. She opened the windows, letting the afternoon breeze and the sound of birdsong chase out the stale silence. The house began to breathe again. Samuel stood on the front porch, the same spot where he had been confronted by Finch just 3 days earlier. The space felt different now, transformed. The humiliation that had stained the air was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. It was no longer a crime scene. It was his porch again. Mrs. Gable came over carrying a warm loaf of banana bread. She didn't say much, just gave Eleanor a long hug. Leo came by too, and Samuel shook his hand firmly. "You did a brave thing, Leo. A necessary thing." The boy just shrugged, a little embarrassed by the praise, but his eyes shone with pride. The community that had watched the injustice unfold now gathered to witness the restoration. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Samuel sat in his usual chair on the back porch. The sky was turning a brilliant shade of orange and purple. He held the small, worn copy of the Constitution that he always carried in his briefcase. He fanned the pages, the paper soft and familiar under his thumb. He thought about the words inside, the promises they made. He had spent his life defending those promises on foreign soil, and now he had been forced to defend them on his own front lawn. The fight was far from over. The district attorney's office had indeed opened a full-scale investigation, not just into Finch, but into Silas Thorne and his network of shell companies. Deputy Miller was on administrative leave, facing an internal affairs inquiry that, thanks to the judge's intervention, could not be swept under the rug. Imani Hayes was preparing a larger civil suit on behalf of the Vances and the other families from Mrs. Gable's notebooks, aiming not just for damages but for systemic reform in how the county handled illegal evictions. A local news station had picked up the story, and a city council member was already talking about a new Tenants' Bill of Rights. The ripples from their stand were spreading outward, creating waves they couldn't have anticipated. Eleanor came out onto the porch and handed him a cup of tea. She sat in the chair beside him, and they watched the last of the light fade from the sky. You taught your students about the rule of law, Sam, she said softly. This week, you showed them what it looks like. He nodded, taking a sip of the warm tea. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, not of vengeance, but of accountability. Justice, he knew, was not an event. It was a process. It was the methodical work of gathering facts, of speaking truth, of holding power to account. It was the courage of a teenage boy with a camera, the patient diligence of an elderly woman with a box of notebooks, the integrity of a clerk in a records office, and the fierce advocacy of a lawyer who believed in the promises written on old paper. He looked over at his home, the lights now on, a warm glow spilling from the windows. It was more than a house. It was a symbol of their dignity, a dignity that had been assaulted but had proven unbreakable. Dignity is non-negotiable and cannot be taken by force. He had won back his home, but in the process, he had helped his entire community fortify its own foundation. The quiet of the evening settled around them, a peaceful and hard-earned resolution. The fight would continue in courtrooms and city halls, but here, in the sanctuary of their own backyard, there was peace. He took a deep breath, counting it. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. He was home. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.